Hey guys, today we travel back 2,500 years to uncover what life was really like in ancient Greece and why it still shapes the world around us. Before we get started, take a second to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of journey you enjoy, it means a lot. Also, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is over there. I love seeing how far and wide our little community reaches. Now let's dive into tonight's adventure together. The fall of the Western Roman Empire marked the collapse of centralized political power in the western half of one of history's most influential civilizations. Over time, Rome lost the ability to enforce its authority, and its vast territories fragmented into a patchwork of new kingdoms and local powers. Historians point to many causes behind this decline, not just one sudden event. Among them were the weakening of the Roman military, a shrinking population, economic troubles, ineffective emperors, internal power struggles, and sweeping religious changes. All of this was made worse by increasing pressure from invading groups outside Roman borders. Some of these shifts were driven by larger forces, climate changes, widespread disease, and pandemics that disrupted agriculture, killed large parts of the population, and pushed migrating tribes toward Roman lands. The loss of political unity in the West and the decline of military strength are universally accepted as signs of the empire's collapse. But modern historians argue, was this really a fall or more of a long transformation? The period we call late antiquity still carried strong cultural continuity with the Roman past. In fact, many of the institutions, cities, and ideas of Rome lived on in new forms for centuries. In 376, a massive wave of Goths and other non Roman peoples crossed into the Roman Empire, fleeing from the advance of the Huns. Unlike earlier times, Roman forces were unable to push them back, subjugate them, or integrate them into the empire as they had before. By 395, after emerging victorious from two brutal civil wars, Emperor Theodosius I died. He left behind an overstretched and fragile army, and divided the empire between his two young and unprepared sons. The administration fractured, and new political factions began to compete for control. The Goths, now inside the empire, were no longer manageable. Instead, they became a serious military force, capable of challenging either half of the divided Roman world. As the 5th century began, more barbarian groups crossed into Roman lands, especially over the Rhine frontier, overwhelming the weakened defenses. The Western Roman army, once a powerful and disciplined force, shrank in number and quality. Although capable generals managed occasional comebacks, centralized control never fully returned. By 476, the position of the Western Roman Emperor had become largely symbolic. That year, the Germanic leader Odoacer deposed the last emperor in Italy, the teenage Romulus, Augustulus. The Roman Senate sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, acknowledging the Eastern Emperor Zeno as the sole ruler of the Roman world, at least in theory. In practice, however, Roman authority in the West had already crumbled. Various barbarian kingdoms had carved out their own power, building on top of the former Roman provinces. While the Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, would endure for centuries more, the West would never recover its former unity or might. Culturally, though, the story didn't end there. The idea of Rome remained powerful. Cities, languages, laws, and even the Christian religion continued to carry Roman identity well beyond the fall of the Western imperial throne. Since the 18th century, historians have debated exactly how, and even when, the Western Roman Empire truly fell. The most famous account came from Edward Gibbon, whose monumental work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, shaped centuries of thought. Gibbon saw Rome's fall as a story of corruption, decadence, and moral decay. He blamed the weakening of civic virtue, the rise of Christianity, and the decline of military discipline. For Gibbon and his Enlightenment era readers, the fall of Rome stood as a warning, an allegory for the fragility of great civilizations. But other scholars challenged this view. In the early 20th century, Belgian historian Henri Pirenne argued that Roman culture and identity continued long after 476. He claimed that the real break with classical civilization came later, in the 8th century, with the Islamic conquest that severed the Mediterranean trade routes. For Pirenne, the so called barbarian invasions didn't end Rome, they simply reshaped it. This idea helped shape a broader reinterpretation of the era, now commonly known as late antiquity. Rather than a sharp collapse, modern historians often see this period as one of transformation, where Roman institutions slowly evolved into the medieval structures that would define Europe for centuries. Christianity spread, cities changed, and new kingdoms emerged, but many Roman ideas, laws, and cultural values remain alive. Recent archaeological evidence supports this view. Continuity can be seen in architecture, trade, and settlement patterns across the former empire. Even in areas overrun by invaders, Roman influence endured. Today, most scholars no longer view the fall of Rome as a sudden catastrophe. Instead, they describe it as a long, complex process of change, one shaped by migration, climate shifts, disease, and shifting political dynamics. It was not the end of civilization, but the beginning of a new world. Historians often point to four major turning points that mark the empire's long transformation. The Antonine Plague 165 180 CE. This deadly outbreak, likely smallpox, struck at the height of the empire's power. It brought a swift end to a long period of population growth and economic prosperity. While the empire survived, the demographic shock was severe, weakening both its labor force and its military recruitment base. The crisis of the 3rd century, 235 284 CE. This was one of the darkest periods in Roman history. A combination of climate shifts, pandemic disease, constant civil wars, and foreign invasions nearly shattered the empire. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, often through military coups, while regional breakaway states briefly formed in Gaul and the East. Rome survived, but only by transforming. A more centralized and bureaucratic government emerged. Emperors distanced themselves from the people, new tax systems were created, and Christianity began to rise as a major religious force. The failure of the Western Empire, 4th, 5th centuries, as barbarian migrations intensified, Rome's western provinces became harder to defend. Mass movements of peoples, driven in part by the Huns, overwhelmed the western half of the empire. The east, centered in Constantinople, restructured and held firm. The west fractured. Even as the Eastern Empire regained strength and reconquered some territory, the west never fully recovered. Its armies became weaker, its leadership unstable, and its political structures increasingly hollow. Environmental collapse and the rise of Islam, 6th, 7th centuries. The late antique Little Ice Age and the plague of Justinian created some of the worst environmental disasters in recorded history. These twin catastrophes devastated populations, agriculture, and imperial infrastructure, particularly in the East. Then came the rapid expansion of Islam, which not only took vast territories from the Byzantine Empire, but also permanently altered the religious and political landscape of the Mediterranean. Both the Christian and Muslim worlds now carried forward their own visions of empire and faith, each claiming to inherit a divine mission. While the sack of Rome in 410 and the fall of the last Western emperor in 476 were dramatic events, They were only the final chapters in a much longer story. The roots of Rome's collapse ran deep, embedded in its politics, economy, military, and society. Military breakdown. The Roman army, once the backbone of the empire, gradually lost its strength. By the late empire, it had become overstretched, underfunded, and increasingly reliant on foreign recruits. Roman commanders often used troops for internal power struggles rather than defense. Efforts to reform the army, such as Diocletian's massive expansion and Constantine's restructuring, brought temporary relief, but at great cost. The military became more isolated from civilian life, and loyalty to the emperor was often replaced by loyalty to local generals or warlords. Financial crisis. The empire's economy suffered repeated blows. Endless civil wars, corruption, inflation, and a shrinking tax base drained imperial resources. Heavy taxation placed enormous burdens on the poor, while the elite hoarded wealth and often avoided paying their share. By the 4th century, even wealthy Roman cities could no longer fund basic services. Public infrastructure decayed. Local governments crumbled. The imperial system became top-heavy, over-administered at the top and hollow at the base. Political instability. The imperial system itself grew unstable. Succession crises became routine, often settled through military coups or assassination. As emperors fought for control, they lost the loyalty of provinces, generals, and cities. Some emperors, like Constantine, managed to re-establish unity, but only temporarily. After his death, power was again split between rival courts. From the late 4th century onward, Rome was essentially governed by factions, palace intrigue, and short-lived strongmen. Social and cultural decline. Social cohesion also weakened. A growing divide between rich and poor hollowed out the Roman middle class. Local elites withdrew from public service. Civic pride, once a hallmark of Roman life, faded. At the same time, court ceremonial became more rigid and disconnected from the people. Emperors styled themselves as gods, removed from criticism or accountability. Power became concentrated among a small, often corrupt aristocracy, while most of the population was burdened with taxes, military conscription, or land-bound labor. Even as Rome struggled with internal decay, powerful external forces shook the foundations of the empire. These included religious shifts, environmental change, deadly pandemics, and waves of migrating peoples. None of these were entirely new, but in the 4th and 5th centuries, they converged in devastating ways. The rise of Christianity. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE, it marked a dramatic cultural shift. Over the following decades, Christianity grew rapidly in influence, not just as a religion, but as a political force. Pagan practices were banned, temples closed, and church leaders became key players in imperial politics. Some historians, like Gibbon, blamed Christianity for weakening Rome's martial spirit and diverting energy away from civic life. Others see it differently, as a new unifying force that tried, but ultimately failed to save the empire from fragmentation. In reality, Christianity didn't directly cause Rome's fall, but it did reshape the empire's values, alliances, and identity. The Roman world was no longer united by classical ideals or shared religion, but by competing visions of orthodoxy and power. Climate change and environmental collapse. The Roman Empire had prospered during a long period of stable, warm weather, known as the Roman climate optimum. But from the 2nd century onward, the climate began to cool and grow more erratic. Crop yields fell, droughts, floods, and shortened growing seasons created food insecurity. In the 6th century, a sharper downturn, the so-called Late Antique Little Ice Age, dealt another major blow, especially in the East. Agriculture suffered, populations declined, and cities struggled to survive. pandemics, and disease. Rome's vast trade network also spread disease. The Antonine Plague, possibly smallpox, and the Plague of Cyprian decimated the population in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Later came the Plague of Justinian, a catastrophic outbreak of bubonic plague in the 6th century that killed millions. These pandemics didn't just reduce the number of soldiers or taxpayers, they broke down supply chains, weakened morale, and fueled social unrest. Combined with malnutrition from poor harvests, disease became a recurring killer that Rome could not defeat. The Age of Migrations. The arrival of the Huns in the late 4th century triggered a chain reaction across Europe. Terrified Germanic tribes, including the Goths, fled into Roman territory seeking refuge. But instead of integrating them, Rome mistreated and exploited them until they rebelled. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE was a turning point. The Roman army was crushed by Gothic forces, and Emperor Valens was killed in battle. It became clear that Rome could no longer control its borders or its destiny. Over the next century, more tribes poured in: Vandals, Alans, Sueves, Franks, Burgundians, and others. Some were invited in as allies. Others came by force. The Western Empire became a fragmented patchwork of barbarian-controlled regions, Roman outposts, and contested frontiers. Theodosius and the Eastern Empire. After Rome's crushing defeat at Adrianople, Emperor Gratian appointed Theodosius as Augustus. A general from Hispania, Theodosius was tasked with saving the Eastern Empire. Between 379 and 380, he took command of both the East and Illyricum, restoring order in the region. Lacking Roman manpower, Theodosius recruited barbarian warbands to fill the ranks. Though effective, these forces lacked Roman discipline and allegiance. Still, he managed a fragile peace with the Goths, settling them within the empire along the Danube frontier. It was a significant shift, the first time Rome allowed entire barbarian groups to live inside its borders, while retaining their leadership and identity. In 391, Alaric, a Gothic leader, rebelled. Yet within a year, Theodosius brought him into service, placing him in charge of Gothic troops under Roman command. The financial cost was immense. Theodosius had to fund these efforts from a weakened tax base, often relying on gifts of precious metals to secure loyalty. His generosity as emperor stood in contrast to his personal frugality. In northern Italy, wealth poured into the hands of landowners, who fed the imperial court, while the poor were exploited. Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, preached fiercely against the greed of the elites. Civil wars and internal struggles. In 383, the general Magnus Maximus declared himself emperor in the West. He invaded Gaul, killed Gratian, and was accepted by the Gallic provinces. To compensate for the loss of the West, Theodosius ceded control of Macedonia and Dacia. When Maximus invaded Italy in 387, the young emperor Valentinian II fled to the east. Theodosius refused to recognize Maximus, raised an army, and defeated him in 388. The conflict came at a high cost, draining Roman military strength. Valentinian II was restored, but real power rested with Arbogast, a Frankish general. Tensions between them grew, and in 392, Valentinian died, either by suicide or murder. Arbogast then appointed Eugenius as emperor. This led to another brutal civil war. Theodosius defeated Eugenius and Arbogast at the Battle of the Frigidus in 394, suffering heavy losses, especially among his Gothic federates. A divided empire, Theodosius died in 395, leaving the empire divided between his two sons, Honorius in the west and Arcadius in the east. Real power, however, rested in the hands of generals and court officials. In the West, the Magister Militum Stilicho, a skilled general married into the imperial family, became guardian to Honorius. He tried to maintain unity between East and West, but faced resistance from Arcadius ministers. Without unified leadership, the Western Empire spiraled into crisis. Its military was weakened, often dependent on poorly trained barbarian forces. Local defense systems collapsed, corruption soared, and the senatorial aristocracy in Rome grew powerful but unwilling to support the military with taxes or manpower. Instead, they enriched the Christian church, Gothic threat, and the rise of Alaric. After being denied promotion, Alaric led a Gothic rebellion, devastating the Balkans and threatening Constantinople. Stilicho confronted him in Greece, but no decisive battle took place. Both sides pillaged, and Alaric escaped northward. In 397, Stilicho's eastern allies murdered Rufinus, Arcadius's advisor, but this power vacuum led only to more chaos. Alaric was eventually named Magister Militum in Illyricum, effectively making him a semi-official leader of a foreign army within Roman borders. As Rome's resources thinned, Stilicho conscripted anyone he could, vagrants, slaves, and sons of veterans. The military recruitment pool was exhausted, troops were underfed, underpaid, and unreliable. In 405, a new Gothic force under Radagaisus invaded Italy, devastating the north. Stilicho managed to defeat him and recruited thousands of captured Goths into his army. Alaric, meanwhile, remained a looming threat, Stilicho's fall and the sack of Rome. By 408, court politics turned against Stilicho. Accused of treason, he was executed, and his soldiers' families were massacred. The army collapsed. Alaric, now without opposition, marched into Italy. Rome was vulnerable, its grain supply had been cut off, and Honorius remained in the safety of Ravenna. Alaric besieged Rome, causing widespread famine. The city paid him to leave, but the damage was done. In 409, Alaric returned. Negotiations with Honorius failed, and the Senate, desperate, proclaimed a puppet emperor. That effort collapsed. In 410, Alaric laid siege again. This time Rome fell. After 3 days of looting, the city that had stood unconquered for over 800 years lay broken. The shock was profound. Christian and pagan thinkers alike blame one another. St. Augustine responded with his seminal work, City of God, arguing that faith should not be measured by earthly prosperity. Aftermath and further fragmentation. Alaric died soon after. His successor, Athalf, attempted to ally with Rome by marrying Honorius' sister, Galla Placidia. He claimed to seek the restoration of the empire, not its destruction. Yet his troops, hungry and restless, continued to plunder. The western provinces spiraled into further chaos. In Britannia, Roman rule ended, as local communities took defense into their own hands. Gaul and Hispania were overrun by Vandals, Sueves, and Alans. Rival emperors rose and fell. Rome had no strength to stop them. By 418, a fragile settlement was reached. The Visigoths were granted land in Aquitaine in exchange for military service. The Western army, though partially rebuilt, was now composed of barbarian units and depleted garrisons. The empire had survived the immediate crisis, but its foundations were shattered. Rome no longer ruled by power, but by negotiation, desperation, and illusion. A fragile settlement. By the year 418, Rome had struck a deal that many saw as the beginning of recovery. The Visigoths, once feared invaders, were now allies. In exchange for grain and land in Aquitaine, they agreed to fight Rome's battles in Hispania. Their campaigns shattered rival tribes and briefly restored imperial presence. But the truth behind the treaty was less optimistic. The Visigoths were not subjects of Rome, they were partners, equal in strength, independent in will. They farmed their own land, led their own armies, and answered to their own king. Rome had gained a sword, but not control over its wielder. The erosion of authority in the following decades. The Western Roman Empire remained standing, but hollowed from within. Its emperors, including Valentinian III, were emperors in name only. Real power shifted from one general to another. Court intrigues replaced leadership. Civil war and assassination became normal. Outside Italy, the empire was dissolving. Gaul fractured. The Burgundians established a kingdom along the Rhone. The Franks pushed further south, carving out their own realm. Roman officials remained in some cities, but their authority depended on diplomacy, or luck, not imperial power. In Hispania, the Sueves created their own kingdom in the northwest. The Vandals, pushed from one region to another, eventually crossed into North Africa. Rome could no longer stop them. The loss of Africa. In 429, the Vandals crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. Within a decade, they conquered Carthage, Rome's richest province. The fertile fields of North Africa, once the breadbasket of the empire, now belonged to enemies. The impact was catastrophic. Without African grain, Italy starved. Without tax revenues from Africa, the imperial treasury collapsed. Rome had lost its wealth, its food, and one of its last functioning provincial governments. The Vandals built ships and a navy. By 455, they sailed up the Tiber and sacked the city of Rome itself. They took treasure, slaves, and symbols of imperial dignity. What they left behind was a humiliated ghost of an empire. The collapse of the West. By the mid-5th century, the Western Empire was barely holding on. Its territory was reduced to Italy, parts of Gaul, and scattered cities in Hispania. The army relied almost entirely on barbarian mercenaries, men with little loyalty to Rome, paid with promises rather than coin. Emperors came and went. Some were assassinated. Others were installed by powerful generals and removed just as quickly. In 472, the city of Rome was the site of another civil war. The streets ran red with blood, not from foreign invaders, but from Romans killing Romans. In 475, the general Orestes took control and placed his teenage son, Romulus Augustulus, on the throne. It was a name heavy with symbolism. Romulus, the founder of Rome, and Augustus, its first emperor. But this was no new beginning. The following year, in 476, Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain and commander of the barbarian troops, deposed Romulus and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. The Western Roman Empire had ended. What remained? There was no grand announcement. No monument marked the end, but the institutions of the Western Empire had ceased to function. There were no field armies, no centralized taxation, no imperial authority outside a few cities. Yet Rome did not vanish overnight. The Roman Church survived, and with it, the Latin language and Roman law. Cities remained, though many were smaller, poorer, and isolated. Roman identity lived on in memory, in language, in custom. But politically, the West belonged to new powers. The Visigoths ruled in Spain. The Ostrogoths took over Italy. The Franks dominated Gaul. The Western Roman Empire was gone, but its legacy would shape Europe for centuries to come. Odoacer, king of Italy. In 476, after deposing the last Western emperor, Odoacer sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople. He did not claim the title of emperor. Instead, he ruled Italy as king, nominally under the authority of the Eastern Roman Emperor, Zeno. This was something new. For the first time in centuries, Italy was no longer governed from Rome or Ravenna in the name of a Western Caesar. Odoacer styled himself Rex Italiae, King of Italy. He maintained Roman traditions where it suited him. The Senate still met, Roman laws still applied. Bureaucrats and bishops continued their roles, but true Roman imperial rule in the West was finished. Odoacer was pragmatic. He distributed land to his soldiers and allowed Roman nobles to keep their estates if they cooperated. The church, now one of the few stable institutions left, supported him. For over a decade, Italy experienced a fragile peace, but Odoacer's authority remained precarious. To the Eastern court in Constantinople, he was a usurper in royal clothing, the Ostrogothic conquest. In the East, Emperor Zeno faced his own troubles. One solution was to remove a dangerous ally, the Ostrogothic king Theodoric. In 488, Zeno commissioned Theodoric to invade Italy and depose Odoacer. The Ostrogoths, like the Visigoths before them, had long served Rome as federated allies, but now they would become rulers in their own right. Theodoric led his people across the Alps and into Italy. The war lasted nearly 5 years. In 493, after a negotiated truce, Theodoric personally killed Odoacer at a banquet in Ravenna. The Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy was born. Theodoric, like Odoacer, ruled without the title of emperor, but he ruled as a Roman king. He respected the Senate, preserved Roman law, and encouraged harmony between Romans and Goths. He even repaired infrastructure, promoted religious tolerance, and kept peace with the Eastern Empire. Under Theodoric, Italy enjoyed a brief renaissance. It was in many ways more stable than during the final decades of imperial rule, the end of the old order. But Theodoric's kingdom did not last. After his death in 526, Italy fell into civil war. In 535, the Eastern Roman Empire launched the Gothic War under Emperor Justinian, aiming to reconquer the West. After nearly 2 decades of brutal fighting, the Byzantines succeeded, but at a terrible cost. Italy was devastated, its cities were ruined, its population diminished. The Ostrogoths were gone, but so was much of what had made Roman Italy prosperous. Soon after, the Lombards invaded. They carved up the peninsula into small kingdoms. The Byzantines clung to a few coastal cities, but real power now lay with warlords, bishops, and local rulers. The idea of a united Roman West was finished. Europe had entered the early Middle Ages. The legacy, the Western Roman Empire was gone, but it never truly disappeared. Its language, Latin, remained the foundation of law, education, and religion. Its legal system influenced kingdoms for centuries. Its church, centered in Rome, would become the most enduring Roman institution of all, the Catholic Church. And the idea of Rome, its majesty, its unity, its empire, lived on in memory. Kings called themselves Rex Romanorum. Emperors in the East still claimed to be Roman. In 800, Charlemagne would be crowned Emperor of the Romans, reviving the title in the West under a new name, the Holy Roman Empire. But the Rome of Caesar and Augustus was no more. It had not been destroyed in a single blow, but slowly unraveled through civil wars, corruption, invasions, and the failure to adapt. Its fall was a tragedy, but its influence shaped the world to come. Rome lives on in the church. Though the emperors were gone and the armies dissolved, one institution continued to grow in power, the Christian Church. In the West, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, became the most stable authority in the chaos. Popes negotiated with invading kings, fed the starving, and defended the city spiritually when it could no longer be defended militarily. The Church inherited Rome's language, its structure, even its bureaucracy. Latin became the sacred tongue of Christianity. Roman law influenced canon law, the very idea of universal authority, the idea that one voice could speak for all, survived through the papacy. The Church became the memory of Rome. Part 11: The Rise of Barbarian Kingdoms. In Gaul, Hispania, and Italy, the collapse of imperial rule gave way to a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms. But these new rulers did not see themselves as destroyers of Rome. They saw themselves as its heirs. The Visigoths in Hispania, the Burgundians and Franks in Gaul, the Ostrogoths in Italy, each adopted Roman customs. They used Latin in administration. They minted coins with Roman symbols. Their kings took Roman names and titles. Their laws were influenced by Roman precedents. The result was not a return to the empire, but a transformation. The Roman world did not end, it was repurposed. The Eastern Empire and the Gothic War. While the West crumbled, the Eastern Roman Empire, known today as the Byzantine Empire, survived. Centered in Constantinople, the East preserved Roman law, Roman titles, and Roman military power, though its culture became increasingly Greek. In the 6th century, under Emperor Justinian, Constantinople attempted to reconquer the West. Justinian's armies invaded North Africa, then Italy, fighting the long and brutal Gothic War. They reclaimed land, but at enormous cost. Italy was ravaged, its cities depopulated, the countryside destroyed. Though Justinian restored Roman territory on paper, the reality was a West far beyond saving. The Lombards in the end of Roman Italy, not long after the Gothic War, a new people invaded from the north, the Lombards. They seized large portions of Italy, establishing their own duchies and kingdoms. Unlike the Goths, they had no deep ties to Roman culture. Much of Italy fragmented, only a few cities, like Ravenna and Rome, remained nominally under Eastern control. By the 7th century, the idea of a unified, imperial Italy had become a distant memory. The idea of Rome reborn, yet the idea of Rome never died. In the year 800, centuries after the last Western emperor fell, a new power rose in the Frankish kingdom. On Christmas Day, in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans. This moment signaled the birth of the Holy Roman Empire, a new attempt to link kingship in the West with the legacy of ancient Rome. Though it was politically different, the symbolism mattered. To medieval rulers, being Roman meant legitimacy. It meant universality. It meant divine order. From Byzantium to Aachen, from popes to emperors, everyone wanted to inherit the mantle of Rome, the Eastern Roman Empire, the last Romans. While the Western Empire faded into history, the Eastern Roman Empire endured. In Constantinople, emperors continued to rule for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. They called themselves Basileus ton Romaeon, emperors of the Romans. Their citizens still call themselves Romans. Their laws, currency, and traditions remained deeply Roman, though shaped increasingly by Greek language and Orthodox Christianity. For the world beyond their borders, they were known as Byzantines, but they never called themselves that. To them, they were simply continuing what had begun with Augustus. This Roman continuity lasted until 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. It marked the true end of the Roman imperial line that had begun over 2,200 years earlier. The Third Rome. After the fall of Constantinople, a new idea emerged, one that would carry the Roman legacy into the Slavic world. In Moscow, Russian rulers began to see themselves as the inheritors of the Orthodox faith, the Byzantine tradition, and the Roman imperial mission. In the early 16th century, a monk named Philotheus declared, "Two Romes have fallen. The third stands, and there will be no fourth." Moscow had become the Third Rome. Russian czars adopted the title Caesar, or Tsar. They built grand churches modeled after Byzantine designs. They claimed to carry the divine mission of Rome into a new age. The Roman idea had moved east, transformed once again. Renaissance and the rebirth of Rome. Meanwhile, in the West, a different kind of Roman revival was taking shape. During the Renaissance, scholars, artists, and thinkers looked back to the ruins of ancient Rome with awe and inspiration. In Florence and Rome, in Paris and London, they rediscovered the works of Cicero, Virgil, and Seneca. Architecture imitated Roman temples. Philosophers revived Roman Stoicism. Political thinkers studied the Roman Republic as a model for new ideas about governance and citizenship. Rome, though long dead as a political force, was reborn as an ideal, a symbol of civilization, beauty, and reason. Rome in the modern world, even today, echoes of Rome are everywhere. Modern legal systems are built on Roman law. Our languages, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, are descended from Latin. Our buildings echo Roman designs. Our calendars, alphabet, and even our concept of citizenship come from Rome. Capitals around the world, Washington, Paris, Berlin, draw upon Roman models of power and architecture. The Roman eagle, the Senate, the Forum, these symbols continue to define how we think about governance, power, and legacy. In this sense, Rome never truly fell. It simply evolved, changing shape as it moved through time. Its armies are gone, its emperors long buried, but the empire still breathes in our laws, in our words, in the architecture of our cities, and in the memory of what it meant to rule the known world. Rome in the shadows, survival in the cities. Even as Roman power collapsed, many Roman cities kept going. Places like Arles, Trier, Milan, and Ravenna retained their city councils, laws, and public buildings. Urban elites, senators, bishops, scholars continued to call themselves Romani. They paid taxes when they could, they wrote in Latin, they preserved books, laws, and customs. In some places, Roman municipal identity lasted into the 7th century and beyond. People still call themselves citizens of Rome, even if Rome no longer ruled. Local bishops became the new mayors, judges, and diplomats. Roman aristocrats became landlords and patrons of churches. The state had fallen, but the civic tradition endured, the language of Rome. Latin lives. On Latin did not die with the empire. It simply changed. As everyday speech evolved into early forms of French, Spanish, and Italian, Latin remained the language of learning, law, and the church. Monasteries copied Roman manuscripts. Schools taught grammar using Roman authors. Latin poetry continued to be composed across Europe. From Bede in England to Isidore of Seville in Spain, Latin was the voice of scholarship. Even centuries after the empire, people saw themselves as heirs to Roman thought. In this way, the intellectual empire of Rome lasted far longer than its armies. The Roman soldier reimagined. The Roman legions were once the pride of the empire, disciplined, organized, and professional. After the fall, they were replaced by a patchwork of barbarian warbands, local militias, and household retinues. But the memory of Roman military discipline endured. In Byzantium, Roman military manuals were still copied and used. In the West, kings surrounded themselves with elite cavalry in imitation of Roman comitatancies. Fortresses were still built using Roman designs. Shields and formations changed, but the ideal of the Roman soldier as a model of order and loyalty never disappeared. Even medieval knights, centuries later, carried echoes of the Roman officer class, sworn loyalty, honor codes, banners, and command structures. The Roman economy after Rome. With the fall of the empire, Roman coins stopped being minted in the West. Trade routes collapsed, but the idea of a coin-based, centralized economy didn't vanish. In Visigothic Spain and Merovingian Gaul, rulers continued to mint coins with Latin inscriptions and Roman imperial imagery. Even when gold was scarce, they preserved the symbolism of Roman authority. Markets shrank, and barter returned, but the memory of a functioning imperial economy remained the model to aspire to. It would take until the Carolingian Renaissance in the 8th, 9th centuries for coinage and large-scale trade to return, but when it did, it returned in Roman form, Rome's echo in the Islamic world. When the Islamic caliphates rose in the 7th century, they encountered the shattered fragments of both the Byzantine and Sasanian empires. In Syria, Egypt, and North Africa, they inherited Roman roads, cities, aqueducts, and even administrative structures. Early Umayyad caliphs used Byzantine, Eastern Roman, officials to run their bureaucracies. Many Roman engineering practices, from irrigation to architecture, were preserved and adapted in the Islamic world. Arabic translations of Roman and Greek texts preserved ancient knowledge and reintroduced it to Europe centuries later. The great Islamic scholars of Baghdad studied Galen, Ptolemy, and even Roman law. They were not Romans, but they preserved Rome's intellectual legacy when the West nearly lost it. As the Islamic Golden Age flourished between the 8th and 13th centuries, Rome's intellectual legacy took root in new soil. In cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo, scholars translated and built upon Roman knowledge. Roman medical treatises, engineering manuals, and legal concepts were copied, studied, and expanded. Hospitals in the Islamic world, known as Bimaristans, reflected both Roman organization and Islamic innovation. Aqueducts and public baths remained central to urban life, echoes of Rome living on in stone and water. But this inheritance wasn't mere imitation. The Abbasids pushed boundaries that Romans had only approached. Algebra, astronomy, and optics advanced beyond ancient theories. Yet behind each breakthrough was a foundation laid centuries earlier by Greco-Roman hands. When Christian Europe began to reawaken in the 11th and 12th centuries, it looked eastward. Through Sicily, Spain, and the Crusades, lost Roman knowledge returned, carried in Arabic texts enriched by centuries of Islamic stewardship. Rome had fallen, but its voice, though distant, spoke again, through Arabic, through scholars, and through time, the return to Europe. By the 11th century, Europe stirred from its long slumber. After centuries of fragmentation and feudalism, Western scholars began to look beyond their borders, across the Mediterranean, and into the libraries of the Islamic world. In Toledo, Spain, recently reclaimed from Muslim rule, Christian monks and Arab translators worked side by side. Together they translated ancient texts not from Latin or Greek, but from Arabic. Texts that had once lived in the minds of Roman thinkers now flowed in ink, filtered, preserved, and sometimes improved by Muslim hands. Aristotle returned. So did Galen, Euclid, and Ptolemy. But these were no longer the voices of antiquity alone. They were voices reborn through centuries of Islamic interpretation, commentary, and refinement. Roman law, once forgotten in Western courts, was rediscovered in Italy and began reshaping European legal thought. Roman architecture, preserved in mosques and minarets, inspired Gothic cathedrals and domes that reached toward heaven. Trade flourished. Ideas crossed borders as swiftly as spices and silk. In universities from Bologna to Paris, a new class of thinkers emerged: philosophers, physicians, and architects, armed not with swords, but with knowledge that traced its lineage through Damascus, Baghdad, and back to Rome. The Renaissance was not a miracle. It was an echo, a reverberation of a Roman world that refused to be forgotten. Rome did not fall, it transformed. It moved through time, hidden in manuscripts, carried in minds, and passed through cultures that never claimed it as their own, but kept its light alive. As Europe emerged from the Renaissance, Rome's ancient voice spoke louder than ever, no longer just in scrolls and stone, but in the very fabric of modern civilization. In the 17th and 18th centuries, during the Enlightenment, Rome became more than a memory. It became a model. Philosophers like Montesquieu, Locke, and Rousseau studied Roman governance and law. They saw in the Roman Republic a system that balanced power, representation, and law, a fragile but powerful architecture that could guide modern states. And in the newly formed United States, the founding fathers turned to Rome, not as conquerors, but as students. The Senate, the veto, the very idea of a republic bound by laws rather than men, all were echoes of ancient Rome carried through centuries of preservation and rediscovery. Yet Rome's legacy was more than political. In art, in language, in architecture, Rome stood as a symbol of order, beauty, and endurance. The neoclassical buildings of Washington, D.C. and Paris did not imitate Rome by accident. They did so with reverence. Even in today's legal systems, Roman law lives on. The Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled under Emperor Justinian, remains the backbone of civil law in Europe and Latin America. Concepts like contracts, property rights, and due process trace their lineage directly to Roman jurisprudence. Rome, once fallen, now forms the unseen architecture of the modern world. But none of this would have survived without the Islamic world, those centuries of careful preservation, translation, and innovation. Without Baghdad, there might have been no Florence. Without Cordoba, perhaps no Paris. The torch of Rome passed hands, from emperors to caliphs, from scholars to revolutionaries, and it still burns. The immortal city empires rise, empires fall, but ideas, they endure. Rome was never just marble columns and legions. It was a system of thought, a belief in law over chaos, in structure over collapse, in the possibility of order beyond a single lifetime. Its body perished, but its soul migrated. It moved east into Byzantium. It crossed deserts into Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo. It whispered through the calligraphy of scholars, the logic of lawgivers, the calculations of astronomers. It returned westward, wrapped in Arabic, wearing the robes of philosophers and physicians. Rome's echo became a chorus, sung in many tongues, shaped by many hands. And in that chorus, humanity found continuity, not imitation, evolution. Every city that builds upon ruins, every courtroom that honors precedent, every republic that balances liberty and order, each is a note in Rome's endless song. It is not the stones of the forum that make Rome immortal. It is memory, transmission, preservation, reinvention, from the ashes of empire to the pages of a manuscript, from a scholar's candlelit desk to the halls of modern parliaments. Rome lives, not in conquest, not in empire, but in endurance. The eternal city was never just a place, it was an idea, and ideas do not die.